the Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead. And today we have Dr. Julie Hudson and Mr. Hopeton Hay of KAZI's book review, who will be discussing this book. Can you all hear me? I hear some feedback on my end.
I can hear you loud and clear, just a little feedback.
Okay.
Yeah, I can hear you. We can hear you.
Okay. Well, I just want to welcome you both, and thank you so much for committing your time this evening in discussing this book. I did have an opportunity of meeting Colson Whitehead in the summer of 2019 for the American Library Association conference, and at that point in time, he was releasing this book a book about the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys, a segregated reform school in Florida that opened in the 1900s. And he talked about how he was how he felt compelled to share this story. He didn't want to, but he was compelled to share this story. And it just kind of stuck with him over time. And it was really an amazing talk to be able to hear his process of how he pulled together his thoughts to write about this book. But today, Dr. Hudson and Mr. Hay, you all will have the opportunity to discuss the book in full detail. And so at this moment, I'm going to let you all open up and talk a little bit more about this novel.
Thank you for the introduction, Danielle, and always a pleasure to be with you, Dr. Hudson. I will say I always enjoy doing the Black History Month events with Huston-Tillotson University because it either brings me back to books I read many, many, many years ago, like A Lesson Before Dying in Sula, which I read Sula probably 30, 35 years ago when I was in kindergarten, if I may exaggerate here a bit, and A Lesson Before Dying, or having the opportunity to read a book that I had never read before. And so when you proposed doing this discussion about the Nickel Boys, it brought me to a book written by Colson Whitehead that I had never read. Matter of fact, Dr. Hudson, I had never read any Colson Whitehead. And so this was and is my first introduction to Colson Whitehead, the Nickel Boys. I read a little bit of the Underground Railroad, but I had never read them before. What about you, Dr. Hudson?
The first time I became familiar with Mr. Whitehead was when I read the Underground Railroad. And because the theme of that particular book is of course, is formal slavery and how formal slavery affected the African-American community. But beyond that, the Underground Railroad, it goes beyond the traditional slave narrative. And I was very impressed with the book. So when he came out with his second book, I made sure to go out and buy it. And I was not disappointed. Both of his works are just outstanding. They're excellent. One way to describe both of these novels, and we'll probably touch on that maybe later on in our discussion, is that while the Underground Railroad is a slave narrative, and part of the motif of the slave narrative is this idea of escaping from formal slavery to freedom, we see that same theme in the Nickel Boys. In this particular text, where you have the protagonist, Elwood Curtis. I don't want to give away the ending of the book, so I'm not going to say too much about the end, but you have this young man who is sent to a reform school, and I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to give the ending of the book away. So
we got to share a little bit about it, because I will tell you that I really identify with the character Elwood. And the reason why I identify with the character Elwood was he was a young man that took his schooling seriously, studied hard, was known as industrious. And his grandmother saw him as, in a manner of speaking, she felt like she didn't want him picking up the bad habits of his peers in the neighborhood. So he always had this special place. And I can recall, you know, being in school and when I was in 5th grade and 6th grade and making good grades and growing up in the housing projects of New Orleans at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so for me, you know, trying to find that balance between, okay, I like school, I like reading books, I like studying, but for me also at the same time, try to still fit in with your peer group who may not have that same level of love for reading and for books at the same time. And so for me, this book, to me, I could personally identify with that. I could personally identify with the dreams that the character Elwood had of making a difference in the world. And so for me, to some degree, it was a coming of age novel as sort of the foreground for me. But the background actually was the civil rights movement because it was in the 1960s. And I thought it was just so sort of fascinating to have this character who we see basically grew up raised by his grandmother because the parents left, mother and father left and moved to California. But to see him just soaking in all the lessons of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and that really shaping who he wanted to be. And I just found that really so inspiring.
Right. Well, you know, the novel, I agree that the Nickel Boys is also a coming of age novel for our protagonist. And the way that Whitehead structures the novel, it seems that the ending of the book is almost to be expected. So let me go back and talk a little bit about to tie into what you said with regard to him wanting to become this activist in the civil rights movement, because as you remember at the beginning of the novel, his grandmother buys him a record by Dr. Martin Luther King at Zion Hill. And he keeps playing that record over and over again because he wants to, he accepts the message that Dr. King is presenting on that album. And it becomes part of his ethos, wanting to become active in the civil rights movement, but he knows that he has to follow certain steps. For example, like you say, he's very obedient to his grandmother because his parents have deserted him. He gets a job at the same hotel that his grandmother works at. And then of course, there's that particular incident at the hotel where some of the older men, take advantage of him.
You're talking about the encyclopedia?
Exactly. And so that does not deter him. So the first part, the way that the novel is structured, the first part is this classic example of a coming to age story. And then at the very beginning, or I should say at the very end of part one, you have that transformative moment in the novel when everything changes.
Now, it's also an American success story.
Yes.
Because the character becomes a successful entrepreneur.
Yes.
In New York City. So he's gone from Tallahassee to New York City, the memories of his past. And the other thing, one of the reasons I didn't run to read it was at times I want to take a break from what I would call trauma novels.
Yes.
And when I say trauma novels, novels that feature a lot of trauma in the life of the main character and that character dealing with that trauma. Now, funny enough, I don't know if you heard of a book called The 12 Tribes of Hattie by Aryana Mathis.
Yes.
And my wife did not want to read that book because she saw that as this deeply traumatic novel. And I knew it was a deeply traumatic novel that lasted 50 years or so. Mm-hmm. But I read it and I absolutely loved it because the stories they tell, and I'm so glad I read the Nickel Boys, by the way, because it didn't have, let's just say, it didn't get me as down throughout the book as I thought it would. I thought it was going to be so much trauma that it was going to be a very depressing novel to read. And it didn't. Did it have some sort of emotional effect on you like that?
Well, from the beginning of the novel to that moment where his life changes, because he makes this fateful decision to get into the car with Rodney. Up to that point, you know, everything that he had done was for his own benefit. He had gotten a job. He had, you know, stayed with his grandmother. He had been obedient. You know, he had gone to high school. He had been a protege of Mr. Hill, his teacher in high school. And then on his way to college, which is another step on this process of coming to age, so to speak, he makes this, well, we don't know it's a fateful decision until afterwards, but he gets in the car with Rodney. And then from that point on, the novel does take a darker turn because of what happens to Elwood after he is sent to the reform school, to the Nickel school. And so for me, what happens to him at the reform school is very traumatizing on two levels, because you think, you know, he's always tried to do the right thing, but then he makes this decision. He's unaware of the fact that this car has been stolen and that Rodney, the driver of the car, has stolen it, and he gets in the car. And then once he is sent to the reform school, he still tries to do the right thing when he's in the reform school, but then he becomes a victim of physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, trauma. So yes, the book, it has two kinds of emotional responses. The first is very positive. The second is very depressing.
Now, Turner, his best friend, and once again, I can recall moving from the suburbs of New Jersey, moving to the housing project of New Orleans, and you're trying to figure out the ropes, right? You got to have that guy that's lived in the neighborhood a while, that shows you the ropes, that shows you how to fit in, how to survive in an atmosphere, in an environment that is so different from what you're used to.
Right.
And having Turner there, sort of in my mind, the trauma's there. The saddest story, well, there's a boxing story, which was incredibly sad.
Right.
Incredibly sad. And I guess a novel like this continues to remind you of the devastation of white supremacy, and how it just destroys the lives of so many young men. And it's just a devastating type of thing. Sometimes I think folks don't realize the others, how their actions that they've just sort of taken for granted, this predatory, condescending, white supremacist attitude. It's almost like it's a reminder that they just expect Black folks to take it. And we see the trauma, but we're resilient and strong. The character survives the trauma. Right. And
what's interesting about when you mentioned the boxing match, it brought to mind how in the first part of the novel, where Elwood is working in the hotel with the other Black men, and this is where his mother used to work, and this is where his grandmother continues to work, and they play this real cruel trick on him about the encyclopedia. And he blows that off. But then when you get to the reform school and the boxing ring, but then not just the boxing match itself, but the reform school itself, that is a different kind of, I don't want to say trickery, but a different kind of oppression. In the first part, you have Black people, young Black men, in a sense, oppressing this Black boy because for whatever reason, that will make them feel better. But then when you get to the reform school, you have not only black boys being oppressed, but poor white kids being oppressed. So you have a double kind. You have two groups of people being oppressed instead of just poor black boys or poor black men. So he escapes one form of trickery or oppression, and then he moves into a more oppressive system that is oppressing not only black men but white men who happen to be poor. So what Whitehead is doing with the reform school, I think, is saying that if you do not belong to a particular economic class, if you don't have the right friends, then you will be susceptible to this kind of oppression, no matter what your racial background is. And I think that's one of the successes of the novel, is that he's able to transcend just simply black oppression to this greater, more societal oppression. And I think that's
the class oppression.
Right.
And that's always, you know, when I've read the history books and they talked about how they've always tried to help the poor white people, they always wanted the poor whites to feel like they were better than the richest blacks.
Yes.
So they were served up race, even though economically they were being exploited.
Yes.
But they say, you're being exploited, but guess what? You're still better than the richest African-American around. I want to talk a little bit about how productive Colson Whitehead has been. So I've been doing KAZI Book Review for about 11 years. Since 2009, I interviewed a lot of different authors. And one of the things I've noticed, and this is just anecdotal, I haven't done any studies or anything. What I've noticed is the crime fiction novelists, especially the ones with series, they're publishing every year. They're publishing every 18 months. The literary novelists that I like, they're publishing every 3 years, every 4 years. There's these large gaps of time between novels. And when you look at Colson Whitehead, who was born in 1969 in Manhattan, published his first novel in 1998 when he was 29 years old. He has published 9 books. 9 books since he started writing novels. 9 books published in 23 years. And to me, that's amazing. And on top of that, as we've discussed, one of, I believe, only 3 or 4 authors to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes for novels.
Right.
And he is one of, here are the Black Pulitzer Prize novel winners. I hope I have this right. The first one was Alice Walker, 1983, The Color Purple. Second one, Tony Beloved, 1988, Beloved. Third one, Edward P. Jones, 2004, The Known World. The fourth one, Junot Diaz, 2008, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. And then the last 2 African-Americans, Blacks, to win the Pulitzer Prize for novels. Colson Whitehead, 2017, The Underground Railroad. Colson Whitehead, 2020, The Nickel Boys. So, but 9 books in 20 years. And I know you study authors, you're obviously, you have a PhD in English, and you're the real expert on this. By the way, people, let me confess, my degree's in accounting, but I've been loving books since I was 6 years old. How do you think of that level of this level of quality productivity we've seen from Colson Whitehead?
Well, I've only read 2 of his books, and as I said at the beginning of our discussion, his writing is just so impressive. I think what separates the Underground Railroad from the traditional slave narratives, for example, written by Toni Morrison, especially Toni Morrison, but others, Edward P. Jones, is that he incorporates. Now let me back up. Toni Morrison does have this element of marvelous American realism. You know, we could debate the character Beloved, is she a ghost or not? But then on the other hand, the Underground Railroad, you have in that particular book, you have a literal Underground Railroad. So what I'm saying is that he approached the genre differently, and I think that's what led to that novel being so successful in terms of winning awards. And then the Nickel Boys is something different. And I can't answer as to why they awarded him the Pulitzer Prize for literature, but for fiction, but he's an outstanding writer. His narrative is very, very sparse. It gets right. It's very direct. His language, his approach is very direct. And I think these two novels are different because, of course, one deals with formal slavery, and then one deals with this innocent young man who's been sent to reform school, no fault of his own. And so I think maybe perhaps the fact that he was so successful in writing about two different topics, that might have contributed to it. But I can't really determine why he won the award. Except that his writing is just it's outstanding. It's just outstanding.
Does he remind you, because when I think of the great writers when I was growing up, the great African-American writers, of course, Toni Morrison, who's at the top of my list, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, who hit it out of the park with Invisible Man. And I think maybe the most prolific writer from the past, outside of Toni Morrison, was James Baldwin. And it seems over the past 4 or 5 years, and I've read probably five or six James Baldwin novels, from Go Tell It on the Mountain to If Beale Street Could Talk, that I'm thinking of James Baldwin. James Baldwin, there's a great interview on PBS from a show called Soul of Nikki Giovanni.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Interviewing James Baldwin. It's an incredible, maybe the most incredible interview I ever saw from that time period. But James Baldwin, I think, in my mind at least, he's made a bit of a public comeback in terms of the level of recognition he's gotten over the years. Now, if we talk about the National Book Awards, we've had Jesmyn Ward, who's won 2 National Book Awards.
Right.
We have, I think, James McBride has won 2 National Book Awards. So this really seems to be maybe like the last 10 or 15 years, a very fertile period for broad recognition for African-American writers. And if you throw on top of that, Walter Mosley,
right,
crime fiction writer, Easy Rollins, he was named a Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America, the first African-American Grand Master. The novel a couple of years ago was the best novel. And Walter Mosley actually is incredibly prolific. He's written science fiction, political essays, of course, the crime fiction novels, literary novels, and I've read across his genres. Actually, Walter Mosley's ability across genres is to me is incredibly impressive. But what do you think about this James Baldwin kind of comparison? And I know in my mind, James Baldwin is sort of like Hall of Fame.
Right.
In my mind, he's Mount Rushmore. James Baldwin is Mount Rushmore. Toni Morrison is Mount Rushmore. Richard Wright is Mount Rushmore. Ralph Ellison, just on the strength of Invisible Man, is Mount Rushmore. But what do you think about this comparison of Ernest Gaines? I'm from Louisiana. Mm-hmm. I got to put Ernest Gaines on Mount Rushmore. So what do you think about this James Baldwin comparison? Just
well, there's a lot of new commentary coming out, or books about James Baldwin, either about him, biographical books about James Baldwin, or essay collections about his work. And I think one of the reasons why Baldwin has in a sense come back into vogue, so to speak, is because the political situation that's going on in the nation is something that he wrote about back in the 1950s, the early 1960s. And I think a lot of what Baldwin had to say with regard to white supremacy, to Black people living in America, to how Black people have been marginalized outside of the political system. He has a lot to say with what's going on in the present moment. And I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are now reading Baldwin. You know, like you said, he's written novels, he's written essays, he's done documentaries, and so on and so forth. So I think James Baldwin, a lot of what he has to say with regard to race, to white supremacy, to politicians, to the political makeup of the United States, says a lot about what's going on in the present moment. And it's good that he's getting the recognition that he's getting now. He's getting more recognition now than he ever did when he was alive. He never won any literary prizes. He never
That's
won.
That's hard to believe.
Right, he never won any literary prizes, if I remember correctly. And so, but literary prizes are wonderful, but I think the fact that people are reading his work and that they're commenting on his work and writing about his work, I think that's more important than winning any literary awards, I think.
And also, we have a comment here about the intersectionality as a gay man, and he wrote the novel Giovanni's Room.
Right.
And let me tell you how bad a man, and I'm saying that in a positive way, that James Baldwin is. There was a book called FBI Eyes. FBI. So the FBI monitored Black writers,
right,
to try to keep track of the movement and to see who would be a threat to them. The writer that they monitored the most, the FBI, was James Baldwin.
Right.
It was James Baldwin. And if the FBI, the level of monitoring they did of James Baldwin, that just shows you, because when you read his writing today, like when you read the stuff he wrote 50 years ago today, 40 years ago today, you read it and you say 50 years ago today, losing track of time here, or 60 years ago, you say he read today. It's his writing is still relevant today.
Right.
James Baldwin, writing still relevant today. I'd love to hear some more from some of the listeners. We do have a comment that they weren't familiar with Walter Mosley's books outside the crime novels. Walter Mosley is a 5-tool player for those baseball fans. I mean, he has written across genres. They also do mention how Colson Whitehead has written across genres. Let's see. He wrote a book of essays, The Colossus of New York. He also wrote a book about teenagers hanging out in Sag Harbor, published in 2009, Sag Harbor. He wrote a post-apocalyptic novel set in New York City called Zone 1. This is all Colson Whitehead. He wrote a nonfiction account of the 2011 World Series of Poker called The Noble Hustle. Poker, beef jerky, and death. And before he started writing novels, he was a writer for The Village Voice, where he wrote reviews of television, books, and music. So he was an absolutely, Colson Whitehead is absolutely just has cross genres. He's been a very productive writer. Now, the interesting thing, Dr. Hudson, and I do want people to open up and comment, open your mic, but, Elaine Hudson, raise your voice.
Yeah, so I had noted about Colson Whitehead. I've been kind of pretty bad. I read the Underground Railroad all the way through, but these days I check out books from the public library. I've always been a public library person, and more so than kind of buying books on my own. I have to say, I've just always enjoyed the process of being able to borrow books from the library. It gives me a kind of a time period where I need to, try to get through the books and that kind of thing. And so I've been kind of borrowing books on overdrive. So it's been, I was very happy that Miss McGee and the library now at HT has overdrive, so I can kind of download audiobooks and ebooks and everything and have them right there in my hand whenever I have a minute or two here or there. But I have to admit that when I've been trying to read Colson Whitehead, even though I love his writing, I started The Noble Hustle. I forgot how much of that I got through before my time ran out on it. Usually I just, you're able to keep your physical books beyond the beyond the due date. But I started the Zone 1. I read all the way through the Underground Railroad, and I hadn't read any. I just knew that it was kind of award-winning, and people had loved it, and it had been a bestseller. So it was completely surprising to me when he interpreted it, very literally as an Underground Railroad.
Mm.
And I kind of loved that because it kind of pushed it from more of a historical novel into the realm of the surreal, or almost science fiction or something, right? To be able to kind of build such a system underground. So I do his, but I didn't realize how many books he had. And I had the Nickel Boys on my list, and now I have it, but I just picked it up a couple of days ago, so I wasn't able to kind of read through it for the talk today. But I'm really enjoying kind of hearing you guys talking about it. And it seems like it's very much in the vein of some of the things that we've been talking about for the past couple of years. The whole idea that kind of part of white supremacy is the whole, is that as a young person, if you're going to college and of a good family or a middle class family and all of these other kinds of things, you get a couple of strikes before you're kind of put in, or you get a couple of mistakes, and those get forgiven before something is really held against you. And so it oftentimes looks like people have a clean record, but they've been allowed to get away with a number of things as kind of young exuberance, or boys being boys, or that kind of thing. And I always think about that because I have a friend who lives here in Austin, and she was afraid to come down to the east side to play tennis with me. But then one day I was up playing tennis with her in her northern suburban neighborhood, and their kind of community, HOA community center had been burned down by a bunch of teenagers in their neighborhood. But she didn't consider her neighborhood dangerous, when nothing like that had ever happened at Dottie Jordan Park, where I was playing tennis. So, and I'm sure those boys, young men or women, got forgiven for that and not kind of thrown into jail as convicted arsonists. I'm sure their community rallied around them to make sure that one mistake in their teenage years wasn't going to stop them from going to college and kind of doing all of these other things. So Colson Whitehead, I like the way he kind of infuses kind of topics into his work, and then also is able to kind of skip through all of these various genres. Because like you, Mr. Hay, I'm a historian, which involves telling stories, but I've always read more fiction than nonfiction in my outside of my kind of, because I have to read so much nonfiction for my work, and I like to read kind of very widely of lots of different kinds of genres. And so it's nice to see a writer who can also skip through and so I assume also likes lots of different kinds of genres, and must read very widely across them to be able to handle all of these different genres as well.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about, the disparate treatment based on class and on race, and that is a bit of an intersectionality. I was talking to a writer some years ago named George Pelicanos. George Pelicanos used to be a writer on The Wire, and he's written several novels. And he grew up in Washington, D.C. For those who may not be familiar, The Wire was an HBO series that for some was considered the greatest TV show of all time because it dealt with crime issues in Baltimore, Maryland. And George Pelicanos told me, growing up in Washington, D.C., that he was a hellraiser and he would get in trouble and the police would always let him go. him and his white peers would always get let go. And he admitted that they got the benefit of a doubt as hell-raising 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds that often their Black peers did not get. But then there's also an issue of class because, frankly, you know, if you have a child, if there are some legal issues in your family, and if you can afford a good lawyer and you understand the system, you get the right lawyer, then of course you may be able to get out of that situation. And one of the things I've always tried to share with my 15-year-old daughter is that there's a certain level of privilege you're going to have coming from a middle-class family, though there's still barriers you're going to face as a Black person. That there are always going to be barriers you're going to face as a Black person, regardless of your class. But there are going to be some advantages that you will get coming from a middle-class family. And Dr. Hudson, it actually reminds me of how Elwood's grandmother did not want him to participate in the protests, did not want him to participate at all, wanted him to stay away from the protests. And he actually, you know, I will give a little spoil. He actually went against her and went to a protest. So I thought, you know, that what we would call back in my day the generation gap, right? Yeah. So the older adult says, no, just work hard, study, stay away from those bad kids. And I can recall, I want to have some fun. I might like reading books, but I want to hang a little. I want to have some fun. I want to play some basketball and stuff. So what are your thoughts on that whole the class and how it's represented in the Nickel Boys and the way that Elwood's grandmother tries to keep him on a very narrow path, even away from the civil rights movement? Well, not the civil rights movement. She wants him to listen to the record, but not actually participate in the protests.
Well, you know, Harriet, Elwood's grandmother, you know, she's from a different generation, and she believed that if he went to this protest, then he may be arrested, you know, by the police, and, you know, put in jail. And so she's of the mind, the character Harriet is of the mindset that, just go to school, get a good job, get married, and live your life as best you can. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier in our discussion, how every decision that Elwood makes in his life leads to that his fateful decision to get into the car with Rodney, and then to go to the reform school. But his grandmother is somebody who's old-fashioned, who's very traditional, doesn't want to cause trouble, wants him to go to school. And so it's not surprising that she wanted him to not go to the protest. And it's not surprising that he wanted to go to the protest. And it's just I think it's a clash of two different generations, like you say, the older generation and then the younger generation. And, being influenced by Dr. King's speech at Zion Hill, Elwood was beginning to believe that he was going to be part of this great civil rights movement, fighting for freedom, fighting for Black people's rights. And so I think part of his decision-making was also to help create a world where his grandmother or people like his grandmother would no longer think about or be afraid of younger Black people stepping outside of traditional boundaries. So I think it was a personal motive for him to go, but also a political motive to go to the protest at the, I think it was at the movie theater. And so it's just ultimately it's just a difference in generational ways of looking at things. And so she wanted him not to go out of fear, but he wanted to go out of possibility of what could happen in the future, because he was so influenced by Dr. King's speech at Zion Hill.
Dr. Hudson, what made you decide to pick this book? That's Danielle McGee's question.
Because it's just an excellent book. It's just an outstanding. I'm just so impressed. I was impressed with it when I first read it, and especially the way that the novel ends. And I really don't want to give away the end of the novel. But
can I say this?
Yeah,
if
go ahead.
Read the beginning of the novel closely. There is a hint. Yes, there is. I'll tell you after.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. There is a hint, and no, it's an outstanding novel for me. And one of the things I think that, like Dr. Hudson, I love reading novels that tell stories about things that happened in the past.
Right.
Because they're easier to read. They can get to the emotional impact and the trauma in a way often that nonfiction can't. So Leonard Pitts, the Pulitzer Prize winning commentator, wrote a book called Freeman. And that novel was set in 1865. And the two main characters, one is a escaped slave living, it's either Boston or Philadelphia. I think he's living in Philadelphia when Robert E. Lee surrenders. And he decides on the spot that he's going to go back to the plantation he escaped from in Mississippi to find his wife, that he's going to walk all the way from Philadelphia to Mississippi to find his wife. And when I interviewed Leonard Pitts about the novel, he talked about finding all these stories, the stories about Black families trying to reunite after the end of slavery. And so even though that was a novel, it was telling our story of stuff that happened in the past. And all too often, I find, well, some of my friends, and I even had one recently admit that, okay, Hopeton, you're right, I can read fiction and really learn history. Right. But all too often, people look at fiction as not being a source of history. And for me, actually, the great fiction is telling our story.
Right. And, you know, to piggyback on what you just said with regard to the Nickel Boys, is that the story of Elwood Curtis is the story of, you know, unfortunately, so many young Black men, you know, who have these hopes and dreams, and they work real hard, and they obey their parents and their grandparents. They go to school, they get a job, and then just in the split of a second, their life changes because they make one fateful decision. But then even though he makes this decision, that does not mean that he had to be locked up in a reform school for the rest of his life for simply being in a stolen car. So that, like, as I was saying earlier, that says a lot. Colson is saying a lot about the systemic racism that locks up young Black men simply because they are Black. Now, when Elwood gets in the car with Rodney, what we learn from that moment is that in the next section of the book, you know, he's preparing to go to the reform school. We don't know what happens in between. We don't know if his grandmother got a lawyer or what, but the point being is that he is swept up in a system, no fault of his own, simply because he was in the wrong car at the wrong time, but more importantly, because he was a young Black man that they wanted to lock up. And unfortunately, that is a story that affects thousands and thousands of young Black men in America today. So I think, as you said, when you read fiction, you're really reading history, right? You're reading history of the nation. We
have a comment from Elaine Hudson. I enjoyed another book about being reunited. called The Life and Times of Persimmon Wilson by Nancy Wilson. That's a book I hadn't heard of. I'm going to ask Dr. Hudson. I'm assuming this is a Dr. Hudson, who's a history professor of HC. Could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Sorry, where am I? I got the name of the author wrong. Let me try it again. It's Nancy Peacock. Sorry.
I was thinking it was the great singer.
Yeah, yeah. Let me put it in the chat. Yeah, so it's kind of an interesting book because it just like mashed a bunch of things together, and I thought I was going to be mad at that, but in the end I wasn't. So it's the story of a young boy who, it starts off as him as a young boy, and he kind of witnesses all kind like the tragedies of a hanging, of a lynching of a black man, and kind of giving him the understanding of how precarious it is to be a black man in America. And then now I can't remember if it starts a little bit before and he was enslaved or after kind of slavery in the United States. But then at one point he gets captured by a First Nations, a Native American tribe of a band of people, and then he goes to live and be in this Native American band of people. But the whole time, and then it also involves, because he starts off in the Upper South, and then you know what, it starts off before the end of slavery, because he starts off in the Upper South, and then he falls in love with this very light-skinned mixed-race woman who's also enslaved. And then their enslaver marches them all down to Texas in order to try and kind of avoid the end of slavery and take advantage of kind of cotton property and all of that other kind of thing. And then he gets captured by these Native Americans, but then he's able to capture this woman who he goes looking for. It sounds like a mess. I'm giving it but it is a great book. And he goes looking for this light-skinned woman who he was in love with, and by the time he finds her, she, it's past slavery. This enslaver has decided to present her as white in his new community, and to marry her, even though she hates him. And so this man is able to kind of capture her, and they live with the Native Americans for a long period of time. And it talks a lot about kind of Native American culture and the kind of work that women had to do, and kind of breaking down and putting up of teepees, and the kind of rules around manhood for Native Americans. And then finally, somebody kind of sees her and recaptures her, so she's supposedly kind of saved and brought back into white society. And then, do you want spoiler alerts or not? And then what happens to her after that, and what happens to him? And so it kind of, what happens to her and what happens to him, if I'm not going to give any spoilers, if anybody thinks they want to see it. So I enjoyed it because, and like I said, usually when it's throwing so many things in together, I can often find it as kind of forced. But then I kind of thought about it, and the 1860s and 70s and 80s did involve all of these kind of wild and different kinds of people coming together, especially on the western frontier and the borderlands and the like, and but still had some of the kind of main themes of kind of loss and reuniting of families and racial violence in just a number of different ways.
Right, and just like with Freeman, the novel is a tragedy. And I guess I could share this. When the main character escapes, he's escaping with his son, and the son gets caught and ends up getting killed. So there's the tragic side to that novel by Leonard Pitts. And also the other main character in that novel is a young white woman in Boston whose father was an abolitionist and who had wanted to start a school for blacks in Mississippi. So the other part of the novel is about this young white woman traveling with her black servant from Boston to this same town in Mississippi that the black character, the former slave, is going to. And she's going down to Mississippi to restart or to start this school to fulfill the legacy of her father, who was an abolitionist. I'm interested. We have a few other people on the call. We have a Tommy, we have a Shawanda, we have a 512-784 number. I'm wondering if any of the other people on the call, number one, have you read The Nickel Boys? And number two, after hearing our discussion about The Nickel Boys, are you interested in reading it or not? So Shawanda, I see you have unmuted yourself.
Yeah, so I have not read The Nickel Boys, but thanks to Dr. Hudson, I do have a signed copy of it. And
wait, where's my signed copy, Dr. Hudson?
Well, you know, when he was here in Austin, he had signed some copies of his book, so I got one for Shawanda. Next time he comes, I'll get one for you too.
Oh my. I'm jealous, Shawanda, but go ahead.
But it's a book that I'm hoping to read this summer. I read some of Underground Railroad. I didn't get to finish it. So that's a goal I have this summer, is to just kind of read both of those. But I'm looking forward to reading it, and I'm enjoying the talk. And I appreciate you guys not giving away the storyline too completely.
Well, you need to thank Dr. Hudson, because I was going to give it away.
You were ready to go all the way in, huh?
I was ready to go all the way through this book here. All the way to the end. But, you know, he does build a furniture, what was it, a moving company in New York City. So he does move to New York City from Tallahassee to New York City. But there's some things I won't reel, because then Dr. Hudson probably would never ask me to do this again.
It's good to stay on Dr. Hudson's good side.
I definitely want to stay on her good side. You know, when Dr. Hudson and Hudson, is it a Dr. Hudson and a Dr. Hudson?
Yes.
Wow. So when Dr. Hudson was talking about lynching, it reminded me of this book written by Caretha Mitchell called Living with Lynching. And Caretha Mitchell is a professor of English, I believe it's at Ohio State University. She actually grew up in the Houston metropolitan area. And I interviewed her about 6 years ago. And to read what Living with Lynching considers the difference between the depictions of racial violence favored by mobs and those valued by targeted communities. So her book was about how African Americans, when they were writing plays about lynching, the different perspective they gave as opposed to the perspective that the white community was giving, which often focused on pictures of the mutilated bodies.
Right.
And then Caretha wrote another book that was published last year called From Slave Cabins to the White House, Homemade Citizenship in African American Culture, where she argued that Black success is most likely to draw the ire of white mobs. Think Tulsa, that it's Black success often that draws the ire of white mobs.
Yes, and Wilmington, North Carolina, and
yes,
all kinds of places. And just as an aside, just to completely confuse our students, Dr. Hudson and I have our offices right next to each other.
Do you ever trade classes?
No.
Not yet.
Not yet.
So I'm going to ask, go ahead, Dr. Hudson.
No, I was going to say, thinking about, how Black success when Black people are successful, and then you have their communities destroyed by you know, what Carol Anderson calls white rage and, you know, resistance. You know, I think Colson also addresses that to a certain degree in his book, The Nickel Boys, because I think the institution that Elwood and Turner are at is designed to it's not only designed to destroy young black men, but it was designed to destroy people who the powers to be felt were not worthy of saving or worthy of helping. And I think when he talks about that, when Whitehead talks about that in his book, he's also making a commentary on, as I said before, the greater society, how society destroys or tries to diminish those people or those groups of people who they don't feel are worthy of saving or helping. And I think that's, you know, and as we said before with James Baldwin, that's one of the themes that he wrote about in his work, is the fact that society, i.e. white society, one of its motivations was to destroy those groups of people that it felt was not worthy. You know, this whole idea of white supremacy writ large simply is a way of diminishing and destroying Black people. But then you have this economic supremacy, so to speak, which functions as a way of destroying not just Black people or white people, but poor people. And I think that's one of the reasons why James Baldwin is so popular now, because he addressed that in so much of his literature. You know, so many of his essays talk about, you know, the killing of the soul of people, S-O-U-L, the soul of people who they feel don't belong. And I think Whitehead does it both in the Underground Railroad, and then he also talks about it in The Nickel Boys. One of the differences between the two novels is that both novels can be described as escape narratives. Cora, the protagonist in the Underground Railroad, she successfully escapes, and then we have another escape narrative, and I'm going to leave it at that. So I don't want to give it away.
And Danielle says we had at 6:30. She said we had about 5 minutes left, so it's 6:32. We got 3 minutes left. I did want to talk a little bit about before we close out, going back in history to how when the robber barons started to fund HBCUs at the turn of the 20th century, 1900, et cetera, and Booker T. Washington was often the broker between the Carnegies and Rockefellers and the money they want to invest in Black institutions. They often were looking to invest in Black institutions that would not disturb the status quo, that they wanted these institutions to produce graduates who would not feel compelled to challenge segregation, to challenge white supremacy, as opposed to the Samuel Houston College, Tillotson, the American Missionary Association. That was, you know, there was a whole big debate about the liberal arts education, and Booker T. Washington used to give all these speeches denigrating the liberal arts education, right, because that's what his supporters wanted to hear. And he was such a complicated man because he was suing undercover. He was funding lawsuits to challenge segregation without his folks, even without his supporters even knowing about it. We got this great comment from Tommy Mouton. There is always a searing and scathing and undeniably honesty in Baldwin's work. His words have always slapped white America extremely hard across the face. With that great comment, this person must be a professor of English or something. Tommy Mouton, are you a professor of English at Huston-Tillotson University?
Yes.
Yeah, I do teach English, yes.
Yeah, I know who you are. I think I'm going to copy and paste that and pretend that it's my own.
Please do.
Well, I'll just take all the adverbs and adjectives and stuff, and I'll use that. No, but this has been a great discussion. Dr. Hudson, thank you for inviting me to participate in this discussion. Thank you for recommending the Nickel Boys. I absolutely enjoyed reading the book, and now I will go back and I will read Underground Railroad, the inventive Underground Railroad, the literally Underground Railroad, and try to catch up on some more. Danielle McGee, this is your library. I want to turn it over to you so you can close it out, because I don't want to say thanks for listening to KAZI Book Review.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much for having this discussion with us tonight on behalf of the Downs Jones Library and the Center of Academic Innovation and Transformation, in addition to the English department. And thank you for everyone all the participants who came out this evening as well. And this wraps up our 3rd annual book club of Huston-Tillotson University. And I hope that you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And hopefully we'll be in the library next year, right? Okay.
Either with our mask on or our vaccination already taken care of.
Exactly.
Sounds good. Nice to meet you, Hopeton. And
good to meet you, Dr. Hudson. Thanks, Tommy, Shawanda, Dr. Miles, Danielle.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Y'all take care.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good.